Before gaining independence, Burkina Faso was known as Upper Volta, a French colony within West Africa. The French colonial administration had exploited the land for raw materials and labor, with little investment in infrastructure, education, or industrialization. By the time of independence in 1960, the country was one of the poorest in the world, a landlocked, drought-prone territory with fragile soil, minimal healthcare, and high illiteracy rates. French rule left behind a weak economy dependent on cotton and subsistence farming. They left social divisions fostered by colonial policies that favored certain ethnic groups for administrative roles. The French also left political dependency, as Paris retained influence through aid, trade, and military advisors. The early years after independence were marked by political instability. Power shifted between civilian governments and military juntas as leaders struggled with corruption, mismanagement, and competing visions for the nation. Maurice Yamiogo, who led from 1960 to 1966, was the first president and was aligned closely with France, but was accused of authoritarianism and corruption. Economic austerity measures and wage cuts triggered mass protests, leading to his ousting in a coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Sangoulé Lamizana. Lamizana's rule went from 1966 to 1980 and tried to balance military control with periods of civilian participation. But frequent droughts, food shortages, and economic decline fueled unrest. By the late 1970s, the country was dependent on foreign aid and loans. By the early 1980s, Upper Volta was one of the poorest nations globally, ranked near the bottom in GDP per capita. It was heavily dependent on subsistence agriculture, vulnerable to drought and desertification. The country was facing widespread illiteracy, over 80%, and extremely low school enrollment rates. It was reliant on foreign aid, especially from France and international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. The rural population bore the brunt of poverty, water was scarce, malnutrition was common, and diseases like malaria and measles claimed many lives. In urban areas, unemployment and underemployment were rampant, creating fertile ground for political agitation. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, revolutionary and Marxist ideas were gaining ground among students, young military officers, and trade unions. The 1973 to 1974 Sahel drought had exposed the fragility of the country's agricultural system, deepening discontent. Student protests, labor strikes, and political dissent were met with repression, but they also nurtured networks of activists calling for self-reliance, social justice, and an end to neo-colonialism. Upper Volta's army, relatively small and under-equipped, played a central role in politics. Many young officers had been trained abroad, in France, Madagascar, or Morocco, where they were exposed to radical ideas about Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism. Among these officers was Thomas Sankara, a charismatic young captain known for his intelligence, musical talent, and outspoken criticism of corruption. Before his rise, he was already admired by young soldiers and radical civilians alike for his integrity and his belief that Africa needed a bold, homegrown revolution. By 1980, Colonel Che Guevara overthrew Lamizana, promising reform but delivering little. His failure led to another coup in 1982, bringing Major Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo to power. Ouédraogo appointed Sankara as prime minister in January 1983, a move that electrified the youth but alarmed conservative and pro-French elites. By early 1983, Captain Thomas Sankara had already built a reputation as a soldier who was not afraid to speak truth to power. His fiery speeches called out corruption within the military and government, foreign dependence on France and Western donors, and the need for African self-reliance and grassroots development. His appointment as Prime Minister under President Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo in January 1983 gave him a national platform. He met leaders like Fidel Castro, Samora Machel, and François Mitterrand, absorbing lessons from revolutionary and anti-colonial movements. However, his radical positions, particularly his attacks on neo-colonialism and his sympathy for left-wing movements, worried conservative factions inside the government, the military hierarchy, and France's intelligence services. President Ouédraogo represented a more moderate, pro-Western stance. He was under pressure from France and Ivory Coast's President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, both concerned about Sankara's influence and potential to align Upper Volta with socialist and pan-Africanist states. The final straw came when Sankara gave an unfiltered radio interview, criticizing the government's compromises with foreign powers. On May 17, 1983, Ouédraogo dismissed him from the prime minister position and placed him under house arrest. This move backfired. Across the country, students, trade unions, and young officers protested. Demonstrations erupted in Ouagadougou and other towns. Sankara became a symbol of resistance, the man the system feared. Sankara had built strong ties with young officers in the army who shared his ideology, most notably Blaise Compaoré, who was Sankara's closest friend, military comrade, and key strategist. Henry Zongo, a radical officer committed to ending corruption. Jean-Baptiste Lingani, a loyal ally with influence among soldiers. Together they were known as the Communist Officers Group, though their movement was more Pan-Africanist and nationalist than strictly Marxist. Their vision, a self-reliant, liberated Africa starting with Upper Volta. On August 4, 1983, Compaoré led a daring coup while Ouédraogo was still in power. Tanks rolled into Ouagadougou, radio stations were seized, and Sankara was freed from detention. By the end of the day, Ouédraogo was overthrown. Sankara, at just 33 years old, became president of the National Revolutionary Council. In his first address to the nation, Sankara declared, "Our revolution is not a public relations campaign. It is a call to arms to transform our society and take back our dignity." Sankara's rise wasn't just personal ambition. It was driven by widespread frustration with poverty, corruption, and dependency on foreign aid. Youth and military radicalism, demanding systemic change, also played a part. Another factor was the external pressures from France and its allies that marginalized him, inadvertently turning him into a popular hero. After the August 1983 coup, Sankara wasted no time. He declared the National Democratic Revolution, aimed at breaking from neo-colonialism and building a self-reliant, socially just society. In 1984, he renamed the country Burkina Faso, Land of Upright People, combining the languages Moré and Dioula to symbolize unity. His guiding principles were self-reliance, producing what the nation consumed; anti-corruption, strict accountability for public servants; social justice, equality for all, including women; Pan-Africanism, solidarity against imperialism. He also made several major reforms. The first reform was on anti-corruption and government accountability. Within this reform, ministers' salaries were cut to match the average worker's pay, government fleets of luxury cars were sold, and officials used modest Renault 5s. Sankara himself lived simply, owning only a guitar, a bicycle, and a small salary. The second reform was on women's empowerment. Within this reform, Sankara banned forced marriages and female genital mutilation. He promoted women to high positions in government and the military, and declared a day of solidarity, where men took over household chores to promote gender equality. The third reform was on health and education. Here, Sankara led a nationwide vaccination campaign against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever, immunizing over 2 million children in a few weeks. He built thousands of schools and doubled literacy rates within 4 years. Sankara also expanded access to clean water through massive well-digging projects. The fourth reform was on agricultural self-sufficiency. He encouraged the use of local seeds and techniques instead of imported food aid. Sankara organized peasants into cooperatives to boost production. And by 1986, Burkina Faso was producing enough grain to feed itself, a first in its modern history. The final reform was on environmental protection. where he launched a reforestation campaign, planting over 10 million trees to combat desertification. Sankara rejected the IMF and World Bank debt trap, famously declaring, "Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa. If we do not pay, the creditors will not die, but if we pay, we will." He reduced dependency on foreign aid and criticized African leaders who lived lavishly while their people suffered. His speeches at the Organization of African Unity, OAU, openly challenged France and the West, earning admiration from African youth and hostility from former colonial powers. Domestically, Sankara was beloved by students, farmers, and women's groups. His style was charismatic, direct, and hands-on. He often visited rural villages without warning, walking among the people and working alongside them. However, not everyone was pleased. Urban elites and wealthy merchants saw his policies as threatening their privileges. Some traditional chiefs disliked the erosion of their power. Foreign governments, particularly France and Ivory Coast, saw him as a destabilizing influence in West Africa. And within his own inner circle, some felt his reforms were too rapid and confrontational, creating enemies faster than allies. By 1987, Sankara had transformed Burkina Faso into a symbol of African pride and self-reliance. But his uncompromising style, rejection of foreign aid, and attacks on entrenched interests were making powerful enemies, both at home and abroad. And among those closest to him, cracks were beginning to form. Thomas Sankara and Blaise Compaoré were once inseparable. They met in the army, shared radical ideals, and co-led the 1983 coup that brought Sankara to power. But as president, Sankara's uncompromising policies and confrontational stance toward foreign powers began to strain their alliance. Sources of the tension between them stemmed from several key ideological differences. One was Sankara's refusal to bow to France, Ivory Coast, and the IMF, which isolated Burkina Faso. Compaoré, in contrast, favored a softer, more diplomatic approach. The next source of contention was the fact that Sankara's reforms alienated traditional chiefs, wealthy traders, and some military officers, many of whom began seeing Compaoré as a more reasonable alternative. And lastly, while Sankara lived modestly, his moral rigidity sometimes clashed with Compaoré's political pragmatism. Several accounts suggest that Ivory Coast's president Félix Houphouët-Boigny and elements within French intelligence were unhappy with Sankara's revolution. Houphouët-Boigny saw Sankara's ideology as a threat to pro-Western regimes in the region. France disliked his criticism of neo-colonialism and feared his ideas would inspire other African nations. Diplomatic cables and testimonies later indicated that Compaoré was cultivated by external actors as someone who could replace Sankara and realign Burkina Faso with Western and regional interests. On the afternoon of October 15, 1987, Sankara was attending a meeting at the Conseil de l'Entente, a government building in Ouagadougou, with a group of loyal ministers. Suddenly, armed soldiers loyal to Blaise Compaoré surrounded the compound. Gunfire erupted inside the meeting room. Sankara reportedly stood and told his attackers, "You can kill me, but you cannot kill the revolution." He was shot dead on the spot, along with 12 of his closest aides. Their bodies were hastily buried in an unmarked grave. Officially, the coup was announced as a rectification to correct the mistakes of the revolution. The news of Sankara's death spread quickly through Ouagadougou, but the official version given by Blaise Compaoré's new regime claimed he had died naturally or had been killed in a failed plot against the government. State media strictly controlled the narrative, and soldiers patrolled the streets to prevent public gatherings. Many Burkinabe were shocked and devastated. Sankara was deeply admired, especially by students, farmers, and women, for his honesty, humility, and the tangible improvements he brought in just 4 years. But the immediate environment after his killing was one of fear, not open revolt. Compaoré's forces acted quickly to suppress any dissent. Public mourning was discouraged, and those who tried to openly honor Sankara risked arrest or harassment. Activists, journalists, and union leaders suspected of being loyal to him were silenced. The army maintained a heavy presence in the capital, making protests nearly impossible. In rural areas, grief was mixed with resignation. Many feared that speaking out would endanger their lives. Some whispered prayers and quiet tributes in private, but the terror of the moment kept mass outrage from erupting into an uprising. Compaoré took power the same day, claiming Sankara had jeopardized Burkina Faso's foreign relations and endangered national stability. He promised a more pragmatic government, but within weeks, many of Sankara's radical reforms were rolled back. Foreign aid from France and Ivory Coast resumed. Political opponents and Sankara loyalists faced imprisonment, exile, or death. Those implicated in the conspiracy included Blaise Compaoré, the leader of the coup and immediate beneficiary, Gilbert Diendéré, then a young military officer, later army chief, believed to have led the hit squad. Foreign backers, particularly elements in France and Ivory Coast, though official documents remain partially classified.
Compaoré's government treated Sankara's memory as a political threat. Public mention of his name in a positive light was discouraged. School curricula omitted or distorted his role in Burkina Faso's history. Monuments or public tributes to Sankara were non-existent. His grave remained unmarked and its location officially unacknowledged for decades. For a generation, young Burkinabe grew up under a version of history where Sankara's revolution was portrayed as reckless, destabilizing, and ultimately dangerous. Compaoré ruled for 27 years, maintaining power through a mix of political maneuvering, constitutional changes, and a tight grip on the military. He positioned himself as a regional mediator in West African conflicts, gaining the favor of France and other international partners. At home, however, poverty persisted. Burkina Faso remained one of the poorest nations in the world. Corruption flourished, with wealth concentrated among political allies. And opposition figures and journalists faced intimidation, imprisonment, or mysterious death. Despite official suppression, Sankara's memory lived on underground. Old recordings of his speeches circulated discreetly among students and activists. His image appeared on hidden murals, t-shirts, and in whispered conversations. The internet in the 2000s gave a new generation access to his ideas, bypassing state censorship. By the late 2000s, as economic inequality worsened, young Burkinabe began openly invoking Sankara's name during protests against corruption and unemployment. His image became a rallying symbol for resistance, dignity, and self-reliance.
In October 2014, Compaoré attempted to amend the constitution to extend his 27-year rule. Massive protests erupted, led largely by youth who had grown up hearing stories of Sankara. Demonstrators carried posters of Sankara chanting his slogans. Parliament was set ablaze. The streets of Ouagadougou became scenes of mass defiance. On October 31, 2014, Compaoré fled the country, ending his long reign. His departure reignited open discussion of Sankara's assassination, leading to official investigations and eventual charges against Compaoré and others. Decades later, Sankara's revolutionary legacy continues to inspire. Young leaders, especially those critical of neo-colonial influence, cite him as a model. Ibrahim Traoré, who seized power in 2022 at the age of 34, has been compared to Sankara for his military background, nationalist rhetoric, and emphasis on sovereignty. While Burkina Faso's challenges remain enormous, the spirit of Sankara's call for dignity and self-reliance still resonates strongly among its people.